International College of Dentists is an honorary organization composed of dentists from throughout the world. The USA section of the college decided to record visually not only the history of the college, but also several leaders in our profession. Dr. H.O. Westerdahl, Secretary General Emeritus of the college, was selected as the outstanding individual to be honored with the first videotape. The purpose of these tapes is to recognize those people who have contributed significantly to the dental profession. How great it would be if we had G.V. Black on an audiovisual tape. Wouldn't it be wonderful to bring back Pierre Fouchard, the father of modern dentistry? Another purpose of this project of the college is to explore the qualities of leadership. What makes good leaders? What qualities lead them to the top? And what can we and future generations learn from them? This program in the series of the Chronicles of Outstanding Leaders in Dentistry highlights the career of Miles R. Markley. Dr. Markley is interviewed by Dr. Ray Krug.
Dr. Markley, would you tell me about your parents?
Well, yes. First of all, I want to thank the International College of Dentists and thank you for the opportunity this interview presents. Yes, my parents were, of course, very important to me. I might take my mother first. She came from Michigan. Before her ancestors had migrated in from Ontario. Her grandfather, in fact, came out into the wilderness and built a blacksmith shop at the intersection of two Indian trails. And then he proceeded to help survey central Michigan. Well, anyway, when my mother was 11 years old and her brother was 9, and her baby sister was less than 1, she became an orphan. The baby sister was taken by a childless couple for care. Her brother went to with his grandparents, who were already elderly, and my mother was taken by a childless couple who ran a little farm, a little truck farm, and they took her out of kindness. I never heard her say an unkind word toward them, but they took her very much for the work she could do. And so she had a very busy life, but they sent her to school. She went through grammar school, and they saw her through high school and clothed her. But she was a very busy person, and we have thought that perhaps that made her a workaholic. Well, about the time she graduated from high school, another lady who traveled quite a bit invited her to go on a trip with her to Nebraska. So my mother went along, and then this woman left my mother with a friend in Juniata, Nebraska, a very small town in central Nebraska. It was a county seat town that was later absorbed by Hastings, its next door neighbor. And so my mother integrated with the small town life, and her teeth, she'd never had any dental care. Her teeth must have been terrible, must have looked terrible. So she was taken to a dentist. Well, that dentist was my father, who had graduated a few years before from Philadelphia Dental College. And by the time she was 20, he had restored her lower mouth, he had removed her ugly upper teeth, and had made her a vulcanite denture, which was really made her a very attractive person. And then at age 21, when she was 21 and he was 42, he married her. Well, he didn't like her name, which was Lizzie Veely, because there was a character in that town named Lizzie. So he changed her name not only to Mildred, but to Markley, to Mildred Markley. So that tells the beginning about my mother. My father was a farm boy. His ancestors had come from Lancaster, Pennsylvania Dutch, to Indiana, where they lived for some years. And then with the opening up of free land, his family moved to central Nebraska. He had been a good student through high school, and he was a beautiful penman, beautiful, and he was well read, and so he taught school as much as his health permitted. Then he decided he should go to dental school. His brother, who was about 10 years older, had become a physician, and this brother went west to Kimball, Nebraska, the far west of Nebraska, right close to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and practiced there several years. And while my father's brother lived there, my father acquired a small piece of land. And he used to go out about once a year to supervise that, which was rented for pasture. And he observed that whenever he went out there, he felt better. His health felt better. And he was troubled with this year-round asthma and other respiratory problems. So he had been married in 1900. I had been born in 1903, my sister in 1905. And so he moved all of his household belongings, including the cow and Nellie the horse and the surrey with the fringe on top, moved to Kimball, Nebraska, which was a frontier town. He became the first resident dentist in Kimball.
There's some more I think that's very interesting about your father. He didn't start practice until he was 36, but tell me about the foot engine that he used.
Well, that was nothing new. I went to school with a foot engine. You can prepare a very good cavity with a foot engine. It may be a little tiresome for the patient and the dentist, but yes, he never used anything but a foot engine. And I was interested in our conversation last night that there's nothing like a slow-speed handpiece to develop a sense of touch for removing caries. Which is very true. You don't have that with a turbine. So, however, I bought a Ritter dental engine, the latest, and I was very proud of that. I learned to prepare cavities. Of course, in those days, we had nothing but carbon steel burrs. I also had an X-ray, and dental X-rays were quite uncommon in 1927 when I started practice. And so I grew up, so to speak, using an X-ray for diagnosis. And I consider that one of the important developments in dentistry within my lifetime. Understand, when I'm talking about a lifetime dental experience, it also goes back and includes my father. Sure. Because I grew up in a dentist's home. He had his office in our home for years, and then he built an office, and so I go back to the time when he was practicing alone, the only dentist in Kimball.
I can remember you telling me a story of something you did in 1946, taking the children back for a reason. Would you tell me that story, please?
Oh, yes. Well, my father, although he didn't start until he was 36, practiced 50 years. And he decided then that he must retire. He was 84, I believe. And our children were probably 3 and 4 at that time. We thought they ought to have the experience of seeing their grandfather's office. And also, I was taking 16mm movies at the time. So we drove over to Kimball, which by then was only a few hours' drive. Used to take all day. And we sat up and we took a picture of grandfather cleaning the teeth and all the expressions. And I have one very good one of our little 3-year-old boy down on his haunches watching that wheel go around. He was fascinated by that.
Mrs. Markley told me that she thinks that you have derived a lot of your work habits from your mother because she was a very hard worker. And yes. Tell us a little bit about the vegetables. My mother, having come from a market gardening background, started me off selling vegetables. I had a good-sized toy wagon, and this was before I was old enough to ride a bicycle, and so
she started me out. We sort of went into partnership, and we shared the income. And I took bunches of carrots and beets and radishes and lettuce and onions and eventually sweet corn and tomatoes around town. I developed quite a clientele. And then the hotels discovered that we had garden products, and then we couldn't supply the demand. So I went on doing market gardening until I was old enough to have an after-school weekend job, and we still continued some gardening. And so I'm still a gardener, and we reared, well, my brother lived with us 8 years going through college, and he's a gardener, and our son is a gardener. It's something you grew up with.
Did you ever win any blue ribbons at the fair, or did you participate in 4-H?
Oh, yes. I belonged to the 4-H club, which was a very good experience. It was one of the activities of a small rural community, and the county fair is a great big event there, and my mother took great pride. She would come home from a state fair with a whole sheaf of colorful ribbons from flowers and vegetables and canned goods and fancy work and that kind of thing. She took much pride in that.
She used a lot of sugar, and she used that for canning. Tell us about that.
She eventually got one of the early pressure cookers, and she did a lot of canning. Remember her experience dentally, and when she became affluent enough to afford it, why, they bought sugar by the 100-pound sack after sack. And so they didn't know any better. They considered that it was good food. And so my sister and I grew up with cavities. My brother was saved some of that, but sugar was a good food at that time. It wasn't until I was in college that I began to learn things about processed food.
Before we leave the people that have had a guiding influence on your life, I've heard you talk about an aunt and an uncle.
After high school, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and there was no use wasting a year in college without some direction, so he and my mother got together and planned that I should go and live with them in Kalamazoo, Michigan, for what amounted to a year, an apprenticeship as a machinist. And so while I was there, I learned to run lathes and drill presses and shapers and milling machines. And he was at that time making bread wrappers that were used by small bakeries. And while I was there, they electrified it and improved it. He had been making a washing machine and things like that. And people would come in, and he could build anything, he could repair anything. And so by the time I was through with that year, I decided I wanted to study engineering.
That's probably the reason you still like to tinker around in your workshop down in the basement.
Well, I grew up with a workshop. You remember my father had his father's tools and a few more. So I always had a workshop, and I was a tinkerer from the year one. I used to scrounge the trash piles down the alleys and find old alarm clocks that I could use power boats with and things like that. And so yes, the workshop was very important and still is. I have a very complete workshop with a metal turning lathe, drill press, two band saws, all kinds of equipment.
Now, after high school graduation, you went to college.
Well, not for the year. I went to Michigan for a year, and then I came back and decided to be an engineer. So I went to the University of Nebraska, registered in electrical engineering, and I was allowed to take, I think, 2 different electives, and one of those was pattern making, which was fascinating. And I belonged to a fraternity. And during that year, I sort of watched the engineering students. And when it came toward the end of the year, the seniors were all worried. Were they going to get a job? Would they be able to get a job? Would they have to go someplace they didn't want to live? All kind of worries.
Mm-hmm.
I got to thinking, well, gee, I'd like to be more independent than that. And I got to thinking, well, my father lives where he likes, and if he's capable, he develops a practice, maybe he's got something. And so, over that summer, I decided to be a dentist. And because Lincoln, Nebraska was 500 miles away, and the school was not very well equipped at all at that time.
As the University of Denver?
University of Nebraska.
Nebraska.
And since we lived only 175 miles from Denver, he and I drove over to Denver, to University of Denver, which had taken over an old proprietary school, and I enrolled in dentistry at the University of Denver. That made an extra year of college for me because dentistry was 4 years, but I didn't have enough credits to make it in 3 years. So this actually was a good thing because I was able to take short story writing and more studies that I wouldn't have gotten in dentistry. In dentistry, at that time, dentistry was pretty much almost, well, I hate to say it, it was a trade school, but you were pretty strictly tied to dentistry, plus physics and chemistry and those kind of things. There wasn't a whole lot of room for academics, so that extra year didn't matter at all.
What was the faculty like in that school?
Oh, the school itself was poorly equipped. It was, I had a foot engine. The chairs were old and mediocre, but they had a splendid faculty. Many of them were capable, successful practicing dentists, and they're the ones I learned the most from.
Then after graduation, what happened? Where did you go?
I didn't even graduate because the Nebraska State Board, my plan and my father's plan always was that he would retire and I would take over. And so I had to leave ahead of graduation to take the Nebraska State Board, and so I developed an office in the corner of the business, of the building my father owned, and bought nice equipment, nice Ritter equipment, and started to practice there. And I had 2 good years of practice, 1927, 28. And then, in the fall of 1929, came the Great Depression. And at the same time, in that part of the country, the Dust Bowl era developed. No rain for 10 or 12 years, and wind and dust. And so more than half of the population of our trade area moved away. Well, there were 3 dentists by that time. The other two were well established, and my practice became one of emergency care, and not too much of that. And I always hated emergency care because I had developed a desire to help people keep their own teeth. And so my aunt, whom I mentioned before, loaned me some money, and we cashed in on an insurance policy and moved to Denver.
Dr. Markley, before you moved to Denver, there's some things I'd like to ask you about practicing with your father.
All right.
What did you learn from practicing with your father? What kind of experience was that?
Well, I really learned a lot more than I realized at the time. For one thing, he had been practicing 20 years, and I learned how popular he was with his patients. They really swore by him. He made restorations that would last. He could make dentures that would last the rest of your life.
Were they vulcanite dentures?
Oh, yes, and he made them himself. He would he'd have to go down at night and take care of that thing. But it was only a few blocks. And so they were very, very happy with him. And when I came on, I was just a young upstart. Here, I thought I was the cock of the walk. I knew all the new things. But they didn't see it that way. That was rather humiliating. Then another thing I learned was to keep meticulous records, because people were always coming in and say, "Doctor," or they usually said, "Doc, that filling you put in last month fell out." And he'd go get out his big book and he'd look, "Well, I put that in 10 years ago, and I told you it would only last 3 years. And here you've had it 10 years.
Well, actually, your father was your first study club then.
Well, yes. Of course, we didn't do a lot of things alike. He had never learned to do conductive anesthesia. Once in a while, he would ask me to come in and do a mandibular injection, something like that. We're always very friendly, but there are a lot of things we didn't do the same.
There was no generation gap.
Well, of course there was, but I admired him for what he was, and he was always a very good father to a prodigal son.
Did he take x-rays?
Oh no, he never had an x-ray, but I had one, and I learned to use it routinely and learned to keep chronological records. And that helped me to develop preventive dentistry practice, because I learned by overexposing films or for bite wings to find cavities 2 or 3 or 4 years sooner than you could in a normal periapical x-ray, things like that.
Even back in those early days, you had a community commitment also. What were some of the things you did for the community when you were back in Kimball?
Yes, well, my parents were church-going people. They belonged to the Methodist Church, and of course I grew up in the Methodist Church. And we had a minister who came when I was about 10 or 11 who organized Boy Scouts. It was very beginning of Boy Scouts. And I wasn't really old enough. They didn't have Cub Scouts then, but they let me tag along. There weren't enough kids anyway for a good troop. So that Reverend Smith was a very influential person. I went through scouting, and then when I came back to practice, I belonged to the Lions Club, and they sponsored a Boy Scout troop. And I became a scoutmaster, and all of the time I was in Kimball, I went out with the boys. Of course, I wasn't married the first 2 years. We went out and had hikes and camping trips, and I found that very interesting.
Did you join the Kiwanis then? I know you belonged to the Kiwanis.
Well, that was in Denver. When I got to Denver, the Lions Club was full, but some of my friends joined the Denver Kiwanis Club in 1933, and I'm still a member, and I have a 50-year pin that I wear sometimes. It's been very interesting work because, well, I managed Boy Scout for them for years through a Goodwill Industries center, the underprivileged area of Denver. We had a scout troop going for years and years. And then I joined in with the all-city scouting. So I did scouting for a number of years until my lecture program took my time.
Okay. Why did you move to Denver?
Well, I had intended to practice all my life in my hometown, and my father had planned to retire, but the Depression and the Dust Bowl, the wheat went to 20 cents a bushel, and there wasn't any wheat, and he couldn't retire, and more than half of the people had moved away, so Denver was my wife's home. I had gone to school there. First I took the board in Wyoming, but then Dr. Rudolph Yeager, who had been my anatomy teacher, invited me to take a dental office in the Republic Building, sharing a reception room with him and 5 other physicians. And so I moved in there. They became my patients and great supporters, helped supply patients through the years. And so at that time, of course, Denver was at a low ebb, but it had other industries than dryland agriculture. And moving to Denver had several benefits. For one thing, I was under the same roof with some of my old dental school teachers, and they were very helpful. I could go to them to ask questions, sure. Dr. George Warner, Dr. Joseph Ures, and others. That was very pleasant. Then we had the Denver Dental Association, which had very good programs at that time, and also the Colorado Prosthodontic Study Club, which had a good passive program and sometimes some hands-on program. I took a denture course under Dr. Bertram Downs, excellent course under there. One of the first meetings that I attended for Denver Dental Association, the lecturer was Dr. George Hollenbeck. Well, I had been reading his articles in the journal and following them in my work during the Depression. I spent a lot of time learning new techniques for new materials that were being developed. So there was no time lost, even though income was low. And my wife had to go out and collect chickens and potatoes and things like that from the farmers. George Hollenbeck was noted for his gold work. He was working in Hollywood with the movie celebrities. But what do you think he talked about? He gave us a program on amalgam. Well, I was disgusted. I was having all kinds of trouble with amalgam. Failures. I'd practiced 5.5 years, enough to have some embarrassing failures. But he gave a wonderful evening program and told us how good amalgam was if you handled it properly. And then the next morning, I got an invitation. A few of us who could crowd into one operatory were allowed to come and watch him operate a patient. Well, from then on, my amalgam restorations improved. And this was wonderful because in those Depression years, not everybody could afford gold restorations.
Well, you've always had strong feelings towards study clubs. Tell me the story, or what relationship did Dr. Woodbury have with the study clubs?
Well, that came later. After the dental school was closed, which was at the time I moved to Denver, this left a vacuum. And some of my teachers and other prominent dentists in Denver decided they should have a study club. And they had meetings and they studied study clubs in New York and Detroit and the Woodbury Study Club and study clubs in the Northwest. And then they invited me to start coming to their meetings. And finally, they decided it was going to be an operative study club, and they rented a space in a building nearby and plumbed it and got donations of old equipment from dentists and supply houses, and they set up a clinic. And then they made me secretary, and then they put me in charge of the whole program. I was to engage the lecturers, the teachers for the course, to get out a catalog and to arrange for students who would pay tuition. And this was exciting. And I was privileged to attend every one of those without paying the fee.
Have the study clubs helped to develop your philosophy towards the practice of dentistry and towards your treatment of patients, and how?
Well, at least the association with the people who are in a study club. Later, Charlie Stebner invited me he was a graduate of Creighton and a friend of Charlie Woodbury. About 1940, he invited me to go to the Woodbury Club, which met in Omaha, as his guest. And then it met twice a year, had been meeting twice a year since 1908. They invited me back, the club invited me back as a guest, then as an operating guest. Then they made me an operating member. And after 10 years of that, I became a life member. This association was very important.
What suggestions might you have for a young dentist just starting out?
Well, Dr. Woodbury always said that a dentist should either join a study club, or if one isn't available, he should start one. And I think that would be my advice. I've worked with a number of study clubs since then. Some I directed, as you know.
You directed several study clubs, not only in civilian life, but you were also quite active with military dentistry. Could you discuss that for a few seconds?
Yes. At the end of World War II, it was realized that armed services dentistry was in a terrible state. They had sacrificed thousands of teeth for these soldiers. And some of the thinking people in charge decided that something had to be done about that. And one of those was Colonel Oscar P. Snyder, who was at that time head of operative at Fitzsimmons General Hospital. And he and others got together and decided, and he had already restarted the dental department at Walter Reed, which had been stopped during World War II. They started the dental intern training program, whereby they took new inductees who were qualified and who would sign up for an extra year, and they gave them a one-year rotating internship. And Fitzsimmons Hospital was designated as one of the teaching hospitals. And so they chose a faculty for that course. Wilton Cogswell, who had written a beautiful text on oral surgery, George Warner, who was a noted radiologist, and others. And I was the youngest one of the bunch. I had operative in Crown and Bridge. And so for years I went out to Fitzsimmons every Tuesday afternoon, and we ran it just like a school. And then when the intern program was stopped there, they moved me to El Paso. Well, at the time this was started, the Air Force had just split off from the Army. And so we had both Army interns and a few Air Force interns. But by the time Snyder, of course, became the head of the whole head of the whole Army Dental Corps. And as such, he took me and Colonel Joe Bernier for a lecture trip all over Europe, which was very interesting. We did the lectures and basked in his glory. Then when he relinquished that job and another man came in who was less interested in continuing education, by then the Air Force had become very much interested. And meanwhile, I'd been going to Bethesda many times, and knew Bill Ferguson, who was also a Woodbury Study Club member. And so then they made me national consultant for the Air Force. And I was to go to all 13 teaching hospitals each year and to have a 30-day foreign trip every other year.
So you've always had a very heavy commitment to study clubs and also participation in study clubs.
Yeah.
With being out of the office so much, how did you run your private practice? Wasn't that difficult?
Well, it would have been, except in at the end of World War II, I decided to have a hygienist, which there weren't many and they were very scarce, and equipment was not available, but I was lucky enough to buy a used equipment. I had an office all set up, and I was looking for a hygienist. At that time, Wilmer Eames, who had been at Lowry for 5 years in Denver, came and asked me if he couldn't have that office instead of a hygienist. And he became my first associate.
Well, you've never had a hygienist.
I've never had a hygienist because these associates, and I've had 11 total, end on end, never more than one. They could do so many things that a hygienist couldn't do, and then they could take over when I went on lecture trips, and so my practice was never neglected. I had some wonderful people. We're all friends. Only one has died. We're all very good friends still.
I know a large part of your success in dentistry and in life you've attributed to Mrs. Markley. Would you say a little bit about Mrs. Markley and why you feel that she has contributed so much to your success?
Well, she was a college sweetheart. We were engaged for 3 or 4 years until she graduated, and then she took graduate work. So I thought I had to establish practice and have a home before we could be married. Back in those days, that was common. And so when she graduated from School of Commerce with her master's, she found employment at a town 40 miles east of Kimball, Sidney, Nebraska, and she taught down there for a year, and we were back and forth all the time. And we laid plans. I bought a little home, and we set up housekeeping. Why is it successful? Probably the most important thing is that she has been very tolerant of my eccentricities.
She told me that she loved you also, and that was very important, and that she has her own interest.
Well, we've had 56 years of married life, and it's been a wonderful life, and she's been very, very supportive. She has done a lot of since she is a graduate in commercial science, she has done our heavy bookkeeping, our income tax, many of our heavy office accounting, and then when the children are gone, she came in the office. And after she came in the office, she became even more tolerant of why I couldn't always be to dinner on time and that kind of thing. And we're very different. She has a very good classical education. She loves to read, she loves to travel, and it became possible through these armed services programs. They were very strenuous, and I got stuck in the hospital in Tachikawa. So General Leitner and I got together. The same thing happened to him. He and I got together, and we decided when I was to have a 1 month, a 30-day assignment, that I would take 60 days, and I would work 3 days. It was very hard work. You'd lecture for 3 days, and you'd travel all night, and then 3 more. So I would work 3 days. We'd have leisure in comfortable quarters, 3 days, and so on. So we went all over a whole lot of the world.
I've got a question I've never asked you. When, during your practice, did you realize the importance of rubber dam, and why have you used rubber dam?
Well, we were taught to use a rubber dam in dental school, but I don't think anybody believed much in it, because the rubber dam we were taught to use did not establish a dry field, and it was a mere fetish. And I knew that. It was a nuisance. And so when I graduated, I thought, well, heck with it, I threw it out the window. It wasn't until that lecture by George Hollenbeck, and I had had quite a few embarrassing failures, that I realized that you cannot do good restorative dentistry in a damp field. And he taught me how to use heavy rubber dam, how to punch small holes in exactly the right position, and how to isolate a field. And then my work at Woodbury Study Club, of course, intensified that. In my hands-on work, teaching over the country, over the world, because I've not taught many hands-on courses in Spain. Dentists who have not had training in gold foil generally don't know how to establish a dry, clean field. I went with a study club, an amalgam study club, in Vancouver, Washington. Vancouver, BC. This study club had been going several years. It was directed by a dentist from the University of Washington, and I was amazed that not more than a third of those men in that study club knew how to establish a dry field. Well, they didn't know the difference with amalgam because it'll stand the abuse momentarily, temporarily.
I brought some items related to rubber dam from your practice, and I would like very much for you to tell me about these items.
Well, these are rubber dam napkins. You can buy them already made, or you can buy a bolt of cloth and cut them out and discard them. But in Woodbury Club, we learned to make these, first out of diaper cloth and then out of flannel. And my wife had amusing time stitching, some of this is by hand, stitching things like this in book club.
These are all different.
These are important when you use a Woodbury 3-jaw rubber dam clamp holder, because that stretches the dam back around the face, it retracts the cheek and the lips, and gives you a much better operating field than a Young's frame. The Young's frame tends to pull the dam off of the posterior teeth. You've got to use clamps, which lacerate tissue, and it's apt to leak. These went off the market when Cleve Dent went under, and it's only recently that they're available again. The DDS Industries, 3932 La Combadera, Santa Barbara, California, 93105 is now making those again, and so they are available, and they're so superior to a Young's frame that they really should be used continuously, except for maybe a few anterior teeth.
How many of those napkins did she make?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
You used them one time and then washed them?
We did wash them, yes.
Every time?
Of course, we were laundering our towels and other things at the same time.
Sure.
There was no problem with sterility. Hospitals did that. They now use disposables, and you can use disposables. But I learned then to use heavy rubber dam, and then I later went to extra heavy rubber dam, which is 15,000 of an inch thick. And believe me, you can retract tissue with it. You can isolate teeth so that you can do any procedure. Impressions are very often taken. But I just learned yesterday that you cannot use an additive impression material, this is from the Operative Journal, with a rubber dam. So that's something you must read in the current Journal of Operative Dentistry.
Dr. Markley, there are many dentists in the world, but you are very unique. Would you please tell me why you think you have been so motivated to dentistry and why you're more unique than most men?
Well, I don't know that I can even admit that. But the fact you asked me here, there must be something. I don't know. I just enjoy dentistry, and I enjoyed being meticulous. I enjoy the patient relationship. I've heard dentists say, I can't work for my friends. That's fooey. My patients are my friends, and my friends are my patients. And it ought to be that way, because you're delivering a service to them that they'd have to hunt far and wide to find. And so it's just been, dentistry has been challenging, it's been exhilarating, there's been an opportunity to progress, and it's been a delight to be able to share anything. It's part of a profession that we do share. And so I've learned from other people, and I've tried to square the score by doing my share of teaching.
Is it more of an art or a science?
I don't think you can separate the two. If it's not artistic, the patients won't go for it. And if it isn't a science, it isn't sound.
So it's both.
And so it's got to be both.
How motivated were you to finances during your practice?
Well, I don't think any dentist ever should expect to get rich, not in dentistry. He ought, however, to earn a decent income so that he can educate his family and can live respectably. If a dentist can't do that, he's very apt to cut on the quality of his service. And I know dentists who've done that, who were capable, but they didn't think they could charge enough of a fee to do good service, and so they ended up by doing shoddy dentistry.
I can remember in 1964, when I was an associate in your practice. I went into your office and I was working on an elderly lady, and I was questioning you about how much money I should charge for the fee. And you told me that I should charge for the fee regardless of the age of the patient. I went back in and worked for a while, and about half an hour later you came back in very quietly and you slipped a piece of paper on my desktop. You had gone back in, either you or Miss Oberst, and had typed this comment. I'd like to give it to you now. And
you read it.
And I'd like
what does it say?
It says, "A thought on dental economics. With technical excellence and a willingness to work, a dentist must have the courage to charge a fee that permits him to deliver a good service. At the same time, earn the comforts his family deserves. Miles R. Markley." Would you agree with that today?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm amazed that you say something like that. Well,
do you think that will apply 15 or 50 or 100 years from now?
Well, it should. I hope it will. Because, after all, we're a health profession. And if we're not delivering that kind of a service, we're missing the boat.
What were some of the things that your pet peeves in practice that aggravated you the most with your patients?
Well, I expected their cooperation in mouth hygiene. However, you have to be charitable with teenagers until they grow to the point that they can accept responsibility. The patient who puts all the responsibility on the dentist is not going to get very good service. And you can feel that you're casting pearls on swine, you might say. There are people that I think were justified in telling them, well, you're going to lose your teeth anyway. I don't feel justified in spending a lot of time restoring them. And why don't you find a dentist who feels that people are going to lose their teeth anyway, and they'll keep you out of pain and comfortable.
Dr. Markley, what was the most embarrassing moment in your private practice?
I'm going to confide something to you I never told anyone else, even my wife. I just had my office open a few days, and of course everybody knows everybody's business in a small town. And a man I'd known all my life had done the trucking. He'd brought my equipment in and watched it being set up and all. And he came in with his 6-year-old boy, Edward, who was sort of half crying. He had a loose tooth that was very sore. And so he had brought his son to me as a new dentist to take care of him. And I said, "Oh, that's too bad." Well, I should have said, "Well, you're growing up. You're going to get a new tooth for that tooth." I should have kidded him along, but I wasn't that smart. He put up a tantrum. And his father bundled him up and took him out, and they never came back, and no member of that family ever came back.
You've remembered that all your life?
All my life I've had that embarrassment to live with.
Of all the clinicians who lecture all throughout the country and the world, you're one of the few that will show and discuss and talk about their failures. Would you tell me why?
Well, I learn more from a failure than from any success. What is a success? A success is something that's serving well today, but may be a failure tomorrow. And so, whenever something fails, no matter how long it may have served, I still call it a failure if it's been there 40 years, and try to figure out why. My wife has just had a new jacket. It replaces a class 4 inlay that I'd made I don't know how many years ago. And I've asked Dr. Hartman to make serial photographs. I know that the cement deteriorated, and as it does under all cemented restoration, and I want to know just how bad. I was out of town, wasn't able to be there when he operated.
I know you have some favorite quotations that have guided you through many of your philosophies and principles throughout life. That you have two in particular. Would you mind telling me about those?
Well, there's one, Michelangelo.
Yes.
He says, oh, how does that go?
Trifles make
perfection, but perfection is no trifle.
That was a little plaque on your desk for many years.
It's still there, yes.
You still have it?
Yes.
And the second one, you remember what the second one is? I've heard you say it many, many times.
After it, therefore, because of it?
No.
What?
If you don't have time.
Oh, if you don't have time to do it well now, when will you find time to do it over?
Those quotations will be good 25, 50, or 100 years from now, won't they?
Oh, in any endeavor. Not just dentistry.
There's one thing we've never talked about, though I never really have asked you about. What is a successful practice of dentistry, and how do you define a successful practice?
Well, a successful practice must give patients a good service, a durable service, a satisfactory service. Ideally, we should need no dental care, but practically we do, and our objective, of course, is to help people keep their teeth for the rest of their lives, and we should qualify ourselves to do everything possible in the profession to make that so. And as our population is aging, we're going to have more and more of a problem with geriatric dentistry, root caries, periodontal disease. We've got to gear ourselves to take care of that demand.
Is it tied up to the amount of money that's made in the practice?
Well, as we said a bit ago, a dentist must make a living, a respectable living, or his service is apt to deteriorate. But so he should expect to have a comfortable, respectable income if he works hard, and if he keeps up, and if he continues to be a student. The world doesn't owe him a living. He's got to earn a living. And dentistry is hard work. It's exacting work, very exacting work. And it's not every prospective student is qualified. So I hope that in selecting students, we'll have enough students want to practice dentistry so that we can be selective in choosing who will be the future dentist.
Dr. Markley, have you maintained your interest in dentistry by being a constant scholar? Do you think that's one of the reasons why you have
Well, yes.
continued?
I've reveled in a journal I read coming down here, and I've gotten some gems out of it. There are two journals whose editors I admire very much. One is the Journal of Operative Dentistry with Ian Hamilton, and he has a full-page editorial each month, or each issue, and that's the first thing I look for. And another one of my very good friends is Bill Howard, William Howard, who's written many textbooks, wonderful person who is head of prosthodontics, fixed prosthodontics at the University of Oregon, and is editor of the Journal of General Dentistry. And he has a full-page editorial, and I always read that first because their philosophy is wonderful.
Hopefully some young dentists will be watching this. What advice would you give a young dentist who's just starting today?
Well, I'd say don't spend yourself to death on an office.
Don't overspend by buying equipment?
Don't, yes. It's so easy to get hopelessly in debt after the expense of an education. There's nothing wrong with was starting with used equipment. For that matter, I would recommend that a young dentist, find an association with respected older dentists if possible. I've told many students to try for an internship with the armed services, because you just can't get enough in a dental school to more than just start to practice. Then you've got to start learning from then on, and so the internships of that type are invaluable. They always come out with, whether they stay in the service or come back to private practice, they come back better equipped. So those are some of the things. And grades are important. I know a young dentist who has recently graduated. I wrote a letter to the commanding general in the Air Force recommending this young man whom I'd seen grow up. And I mentioned the fact that his grades weren't as good as, that I didn't think his grades really recognized his ability. And in the letter I got back from the general, he said, you know, we have a problem. Unless an inductee or a service dentist has reasonably good grades, we have difficulty getting him into graduate training program. And so this young man was turned down.
So the newness of the equipment has nothing to the...
No. You should have a comfortable, attractive office. It should certainly be clean. But a patient doesn't know the difference between this year's model and a model 5 years ago in dental equipment. And if you can find a practice that has already been started, somebody retiring, that's ideal, because you've already got a little edge, a little start. People who are accustomed to going there.
Would you be as eager to start over today, starting your practice?
Well, remember, I started in Denver at the bottom of the Depression, and that Depression is by all means much worse than anything we've seen since. So, I don't know, perhaps there are too many dentists now. There were too many dentists then for the patients who had money to pay the fees. Things are different now. You have your third-party insurance and that kind of thing that you must cope with. Might be a little bewildered how to start, but I think the problems are essentially the same.
I think personally that you would be just as eager to start over today as you were in the 30s.
Oh, yes, 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 and that's one of the beauties of youth. I don't have quite as much enthusiasm about starting something new now as I once did, but I can still do so.
You have always maintained a spark of enthusiasm for dentistry, not only dentistry but for life. Is there a secret to that?
I don't know. I just be alert. But try to keep up in whatever you're doing. I like to excel in anything I do. I never enjoyed golf. I couldn't see that it produced very much, and yet it's wonderful recreation. It isn't exercise.
Now, next week when you go sailing, are you going to try to be the best sailor on that water?
I'm really going to be a passenger. My brother has a navigator's license that he got in the service, and he loves sailing, and his son grew up sailing. I'm just going to be a passenger, but I'm going to enjoy it.
We have a scare, a mercury scare in dentistry today, and I would like for you, Dr. Markley, to comment. Do you think there is a need for a mercury scare in dentistry? Is there a reason for us to be overly aware of mercury and its use in dentistry today?
Well, we need to be aware of mercury as we are of x-rays, of radiology. We've learned a lot that way. But this hysteria over mercury in restorations is absolutely unfounded. A dentist should be aware of the fact that he's contacting mercury, and so he should be careful about handling it and having it in the air that kind of thing, but for patients have absolutely nothing to worry about. I don't believe you know a single dentist who's ever had any problem from a mercury allergy or poisoning.
What's the reason for this big scare?
Oh, it's a result of individuals who are looking for, well, they're sensationalists. I understand they had the same thing when smallpox vaccination became possible. Awful scares about how it would kill people. You're injecting germs and all that kind of thing. We have the same thing with the anti-fluoridationists. We still have it.
Sure.
There are areas that don't have. Why, fluoridation is the best documented preventive of anything we know. And yet there are anti-fluoridationists still making names for themselves and depriving people of some areas of the protection that fluoride provides.
Do you think that present-day composites will replace silver amalgam?
Present-day composites?
The present-day composites.
No, they don't have the qualifications. However, I think composites may replace metallic filling sometime. Remember, they're going to build the stealth bomber out of 60% composite?
Yes.
But that composite doesn't have to be compatible with living tissue. It doesn't have to be attached to something full of moisture as tooth structure. Our present composites are altogether too moisture sorptive to ever be serviceable. It's impossible to build, almost impossible to build a proper contact and maintain it. Gingival margins it just isn't possible. I went out and watched a young dentist, not so young now, but he used to spend hours in my office, who learned to be an excellent operator. And he's gotten bit by the mercury bug, and he's removing amalgams and placing composites. And I asked him if I'd come out and watch him operate. And so I watched him place 2 class 2 composites. He spent twice, and he's a capable dentist, he spent twice as much as he would on a good amalgam, and when they were finished, the margins were terrible. The contour was terrible. This is a disservice to humanity. It's going to discredit our profession. Some of these days, you're going to see some awful lawsuits against dentists who have sacrificed good, sound restorations and had composites placed. You watch.
Are the composites more moisture sensitive than amalgam?
Oh, well, amalgam has to be operated in a dry field because you don't want any pellicle in the cavity between the tooth and the material. But once amalgam is placed, it's completely inert to moisture, especially our new amalgam with low creep and low corrosion, high resistance to corrosion. So, and it's compatible with pulps. Amalgam is the kindest material to pulps that you can put in a tooth, while composites are right with, well, they're just pulp, poison. Ask Stanley. Stanley's our best pulp pathologist. When he says there's a composite that is compatible with pulp tissue, that's good. Then when Ralph Phillips says we have one that will stand abrasion tests and contour tests, then we have something to work with. At the present time, manufacturers are promoting composites. And they make money on them, and the patient is the loser. And the dentist is going to be discredited. He's going to lose his reputation.
In your opinion, Dr. Markley, what's happening to dental ethics in today's world?
Well, ethics can change, like evolution. But ethics change slowly. There's no reason for a revolution in ethics. The thing that's brought this about has been a questionable court decision that dentists do have a right to advertise. We've been able to hold that down on a professional basis of ethics. And now dentists are going hog wild. I don't know any commodity that a person can buy with a greater variation of excellence or serviceability than dental service. Now, what can you put in the yellow pages, in a box in the yellow page, or on a handbill that will enhance your service to the public? Now, if advertising meant educating people to what dentistry can provide for them, that's okay. Anything that will bring more patients to have better dental care is good. But anything that tries to twist your patient to somebody else, this is unproductive. It's no more sound than gambling.
I can remember one time you told me that having a dental license is the same as a franchise, and you owe the public the very best you can possibly give to the public in care, skill, and judgment. You've always practiced with those philosophical terms, haven't you?
Yes, I served for 6 years on the Colorado State Board. And you have to judge, one of the things you try to judge is the sincerity of the applicant. It's well known that some dentists who deliver good service in dental school go out and deliver a shoddy service. And this is, you have to try to sort them out.
Unfortunately, there's more to it than just grades, isn't there?
Oh, yes, yes. Ethics, honesty. A patient doesn't know the difference. A dentist has got to be honest.
Is there a need for ethics to change today?
Very little, very little. Like evolution, change a little, yes, perhaps, but not a revolution. No place for it at all.
We're seeing a revolution now, aren't we?
Yes, we are. And the outcome I can't predict. But would you choose a dentist by the person who has the most glaring advertisement in the yellow pages?
No, sir.
You know better.
Sure.
So it'll be a matter of education to the public.
What about dental advertising? How do you feel about dental advertising, and do you think that dental advertising would have helped you to build a practice faster back in Kimball or Denver, Colorado, when you first started?
Well, we've just been talking about that. Have you heard the saying that if a person can build a better mousetrap than his neighbor, the world will beat a pathway to his door?
Sure.
I feel that way about dentistry.
What about in the long run, in the future years? Do you think that the current dental advertising will be harmful or beneficial to our profession?
Well, the patient is going to have to pay for all that advertising. It's a wonderful thing for the telephone company. It ought to raise their stock. But it doesn't do a thing for the patient except raise his fee, his cost. That's all I can see it does.
I see that the men who need patients are the ones that advertise. And generally speaking, the men that do not need patients, you cannot interest them in advertising.
Well, I gave a lecture for the Colorado State meeting last month about study clubs. And I suggested that rather than advertising, a dentist should qualify himself by belonging to a study club and delivering a better service to his clientele.
Sure.
As a result. That will be published in the Journal of General Dentistry.
I have a question I've always wanted to ask you, and I know many men throughout the country feel the same way. If you could repeat your life, what mistakes would you like to correct, or have you made any mistakes?
Oh, sure. Well, I wasn't too smart in investments. I used to let my patients sell me things that weren't too sound. I finally got a good financial advisor who made it possible for me to retire comfortably. I would spend more time with my children, I think, as they were growing up. But fortunately, I had a wife, Winifred, who pretty well did that for me. She worked with Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and she really filled in very well there. I don't have too many regrets. I certainly wouldn't change professions. I wouldn't change where I live. I think a dentist should choose a place where he will enjoy living. He has a right to do that. A place that will welcome him. Probably there are too many dentists in some places, but there's a lot of satisfaction can come from practicing dentistry in a small place. You can become a real part of the community. I have a classmate who's still practicing in a small town in southern Colorado. The whole valley loves him. He's a terrific surgeon. He takes care of all the automobile wrecks, and I don't know what they'll ever do when he has to retire.
I regard you as the Dean of General Practitioners throughout the world. Your name, Miles Markley, is synonymous with pens. I would be amiss if I did not ask you a question about pens. So let's talk a little bit about pens. How did you discover the use of retentive pens in dentistry?
Well, actually, I used pens in college. There was a football player who lost his anterior bridge in every football game. And one of my instructors suggested that we use iridium platinum pins in the casting. And that bridge stayed then. But in amalgam, when did I do that? I have always had a feeling against destroying any tooth structure unnecessarily. And so I tried in my early practice to restrict my preparation to conserve tooth structure. And then I began to have fractured isthmus in class 2s and that kind of thing. Well, finally, I conceived the idea that instead of cutting away a lot of tooth in order to get a big bulk, which weakened the tooth, I began to see fractures in teeth in my practice and my father's, that we could use an occasional pin here and there rather than making a big dovetail somewhere. And I started out by using an occasional pin for additional retention. And then I went from there to more and more and more. We were already using cemented threaded pins in our castings, and so it was just a matter of going one step further and placing pins and building amalgam over them. And it was phenomenal, really. And so I used more and more and more pins. Then the manufacturers came along, and first they tried to patent pins, and they couldn't do it. They'd been used too long. So then they patented a forced pin, one that they could force in. They could patent that. And 2 or 3 companies, at least 3, started manufacturing and promoting forced pins. Well, that places stress on teeth. It checks tooth structure. It leads to eventual fractures. While you can place as many cemented pins as there is space, and there's no installation stress, and once they're all tied together with amalgam, it makes a strong, rigid tooth out of a very weak one. And so I have continued to use cemented pins, but the manufacturers have broadcast, they've supplied all the dental schools with forced pins. They've publicized them, they've advertised them, and at the present time, the Almore Company has taken over making the cemented pins. They are available, but the other people like Whale Dent and Unitech haven't been cooperative, of course. We found that you could make pin amalgam foundations for gold structures which you can combine with an endopost. A non-vital tooth with an endopost and a circle of pins is the most retentive thing you can build a fixed prosthesis on. And so I've been enthusiastic about pins. I saw a patient very recently who, in the early 1950s, we built some tremendous pin amalgams for. And I hadn't seen her for years, but she's still got them all. We keep seeing those old-time pin retained and reinforced, really, amalgams.
You used to show a picture in your slides of them building a building, and you took this picture out of your office window, and it showed. Tell me about that.
Well, it's just an engineering principle. Denver's built on sands, so they put down great pylons, and then with steel they build floor by floor by floor, and it's much like working in amalgam. We have a 28-story building in Denver that was built with one continuous pour of concrete through a 30 days time. Never did it set. That's the way we build an amalgam. And we build it over pins instead of over girders and reinforcement. And it works.
When the turbine first came out in the early 50s, what were your early impressions of the turbine?
Well, I was scared because, for one thing, dentists could cut faster than they could think. And then for another thing, we didn't have instruments, cutters, designed for that speed. They were altogether too large. And it took quite a while to get properly designed burrs, diamonds, etc. And then another thing, the original chucks were very bad. They weren't rigid. They didn't run true. They chattered. And of course, any turbine will cut a hole bigger than the burr. And it led dentists to overcutting. It was so easy to cut that they're cutting down really sound teeth and putting jackets on them, teeth that should never be so mutilated. And so it's been a mixed blessing. It's much easier to work with them. It's an improvement in dentistry, but you just have to learn to use it. It's like a high-powered motor car. You can run it fast enough to kill yourself, but you can have the pleasure of control. You can get out of the way of a hazard. You can control it. And there is something, though. You don't have sense of touch with a turbine. And I don't think any cavity should be finished with a turbine. That is an internal preparation. Maybe you can finish a jacket with a turbine, but for removing caries,
deep caries,
for cutting locks, for an amalgam, for conservative cutting, you can do the drudgery with a tiny burr under water and air, and then finish at lower speed, which gives you a sense of touch, which allows you to be more conservative than if you try to do it all with a turbine.
I found you to be a very warm, compassionate person. I've known you for a number of years. I was your associate for 6 or 7 years in Republic Building. And the harshest words in all those years, maybe 25 or 26 years, I ever heard come out of your mouth was one night after work. It must have been 6 or 6:30. We were in your lab talking, as we frequently did. And we were the certain name of a dentist came up, and you called him a scoundrel. And that's the worst I've ever heard you say of anyone. I've never heard you say a bad word. And I often wonder what you say or what do you think when you bang your finger with a hammer?
Well,
where did that virtue come from?
My parents were articulate without using expletives, and so I learned that way maybe. And as for my contemporary, he happened to be a person who was influencing other dentists by lecturing, and he couldn't back up what he talked about. And so I was disgusted with him for that reason. He was just too big for his britches. And I thought he was doing harm.
Dr. Markley, in your lifetime, how do you regard your lifetime of dental practice and dental teaching?
Well, it's been a very exciting, pleasurable experience, challenging, I'm completely happy with the way it's gone. I would do it again. Does that answer the question?
Are you content with the younger fellows coming up?
Well, that's another thing. I guess there always has been a generation gap. We can be hopeful of the future. There's one thing we can do, and that's try to influence the right kind of young people to study dentistry. There are more and more girls entering dentistry, and they're doing very well. And they're going to be real competition for their male contemporaries. They're gentle, and that's important in dentistry. Yes, I think dentistry has a bright future. It will have to change because of the geriatric problem. It has to change because of preventive dentistry. You might say that fluoridation has moved the caries area ahead a number of years. And perhaps sugar substitutes are going to lessen the consumption of that caries-producing product. So dentistry is going to change, but there's going to be a place for dentists. We're going to have anomalies, we're going to have accidents, we have people living longer, and keeping people's teeth healthy and comfortable through a long life is going to be a real challenge to the dentists of the future.
Dr. Markley, I'd like to ask you a personal and intimate question, a question that probably no one has ever asked you before. What's the most serious disagreement that you and Mrs. Markley have ever had?
Well, her mother was a professional milliner before she was married. She made beautiful hats. And so my wife grew up with an appreciation of women's hats, which they all were in that day. I considered those little bits of ribbon very exorbitantly expensive. And we used to have arguments over what she paid for hats. But the way we resolved it was, finally, we agreed that she was never to tell me what a hat cost. She could show it to me. And I never had to tell her what I spent on a fishing trip.
You were telling me about a television program where a physician in Colorado Springs, I think, made some interesting comments about dentistry, and I think it would be interesting if you would repeat that story to me.
Oh, yes. This MD is head of health and welfare for the state of Colorado, a very important position. The Denver General Hospital, the old people's homes, he deals with all of these retired people who are partly wards of the state. And he said that he had often asked these elderly people what it was, in order to keep them happy, ask them what it was that they wished they had that they didn't have. He said the invariable reply was teeth.
That's interesting.
So it's up to us as dentists to provide that need.
I have one other intimate question that I would like to know. Have you had a lot of trouble with your own teeth and gum tissue?
Well, I had many cavities because, you know, I grew up on a high sugar diet, and I wasn't probably too good in my oral hygiene before dental school. So I had many restorations. However, I do have all of my teeth. I recently had some restoration failures as a result of cement bases, which gave me some very good material for lectures, but I do have them all. I do see, I don't have a periodontal problem, but I do see a periodontist regularly. He sees a great many of my patients, and I just don't want to ever lose any of those teeth. I do have one endodontically treated tooth. They're all mine.
Dr. Markley, I would just like to say that it's been an extreme honor for me to interview you today. You have been a very close friend. There is no dentist that I have more admiration and respect for than you. You have been a friend, a confidant, and an educator to me. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed this visit with you ever so much.
Thank you, sir.
We'll continue to be good friends.
Yes.